This is Tanya Poboda, Schooled by Gru, and this is March Women's History Month, where we celebrate women in board game design. This is Schooled by Gru, an exclusive series for Our Family Plays Games Voices, where I do a deep dive into my PhD dissertation research and share with you the findings before the rest of the world sees it, exclusively on Our Family Plays Games. One of the top-line findings of my PhD dissertation was that the board game design sector was very heavily white male-dominated. Of the top 400 Board Game Geek ranked games, 92.6% of the designers responsible for those games were white men. And there's a challenge here in terms of women in board game design. One, this is a very white male-dominated space, but two, women in board game design often don't get credit for their work. One of the more famous or perhaps infamous examples of appropriated labor and disappeared contributions of women in board game design is the story of Lizzie McGee. In 1903, she applied for a patent for her game, The Landlord's Game. It was a game that would later go on to become Monopoly. And of course, for folks who know the story, you know that this is a story of theft and intrigue. Her design was actually stolen by Charles Darrow, a man who had lost his job and was down on his luck, and sold it to Parker Brothers. And what happened with Lizzie McGee was she was bought out for the paltry sum of $500, while Charles Darrow went on to become a multimillionaire as a result of his Monopoly game. The real story, of course, was Lizzie McGee had designed it. This is an image of Eleanor Abbott, who created Candyland. And the story of Candyland is actually a really beautiful one. Eleanor Abbott had spent many weeks in hospital convalescing from polio and wanted to give children something to take their mind off being away from friends and family and dealing with the long hours of convalescing in hospital, and wanted to give them something beautiful to take their minds off of that isolation and often pain. So she published this design in the late 40s to help children enjoy themselves. And also it comes from that feeling of empathy for kids dealing with tough situations. Now fast forward to modern times, and we have Elizabeth Hargrave, who is a wonderful example of a woman in board game design who also does a lot of work to help other women and BIPOC designers get their voices heard in board game design. She actually conducted a fascinating, incredibly useful study called OMG, My Wife Wants to Play Your Game, where she did a deep dive analysis of participation in board game design fora and groups. And she created this wonderful analogy of a man going to a Zumba class, which is basically a Latin-inspired exercise. And she said that being a woman in board game design is very like the only man in a Zumba class. It's a huge barrier to entry and can feel quite isolating. So as she says here, it's rather akin to that lone man coming back to Zumba, being a woman in board game design. There are so many wonderful women in board game design. Women like Letitia Williams, who co-designed the mass-market trivia game Black Card Revoked, which was then turned into a Black culture trivia show on BET. She's also the co-founder of the publishing company Cards for All People. Then there is Our Family Plays Games Voices own Fortessa Elise. She is the designer of the Book of Villainy, as well as an upcoming game called Mansplaining. The Book of Villainy is all about being a B-class villain, struggling to build up your infamy and get noticed. And Mansplaining is a game that's coming out in 2022, and I can hardly wait to get my hands on it. There's Tanisha Hall, the designer of Hillman the Game, which was a response to playing the game of life and not seeing Black representation in it. She's also created her own publishing company, In All Seriousness. There's Chidi Page, who's a biologist, a STEM educator, and board game designer who's created Birdwiser the Game, another game I can hardly wait to get my hands on. I adore STEM games. There are so many wonderful women, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, in board game design, all worth celebrating. If you haven't already checked it out, Elizabeth Hargrave maintains a wonderful repository of published women in board game design, as well as Black voices in board game design, with this URL listed here. And I strongly encourage you to check it out. A lot of the qualitative comments I got during my PhD research into board games sounded a lot like this comment here. This was a response to an online survey I conducted, and this quote says, "Gaming is fun and would be even more fun if it wasn't so white male centric." Lots of commenters talked about wanting to hear from new voices, different voices in board gaming. Other comments to my online survey talked about overcoming and the challenges with overcoming systemic racism and sexism in board gaming. This commenter said, "In fact, I'm highly respected at our local convention, and people come to me if they want to learn an awesome game. Yes, there are guys out there who don't believe me at first and make it tough, but when they realize I'm the only one with the answer they need, they realize that I'm not as dim-witted as they thought." And that's one of the big challenges with gatekeeping and systemic sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia in board gaming that we all need to overcome. Here's another comment I got during the online survey I conducted for my PhD dissertation, and since I read this comment, it has really stuck in my mind, and it reads, "I haven't been out for very long, so I haven't engaged with the board gaming community outside of personal friends presenting female." And this comment, again, sticks in my mind because it really speaks to why I started this research in the first place. I wanted to ensure that board gaming was inclusive and welcoming to every person. And as I celebrate women's accomplishment in board game design, I also celebrate my trans sisters' accomplishments in board game design, within the hobby, and their contributions to every part of life. My feminism includes my trans sisters. Here's a quote that I include in the final chapter of my dissertation, and it reads, "We need less games that are about cis white maleness. We need more feminism. We need more racial diversity. We don't just need one thing, we need more everything in gaming." And this is from Amber Coleman Mortley's 11-year-old daughter. She conducted her own book review of Feminism in Play, a book that means a lot to me. And I asked permission of Amber Coleman Mortley to include her daughter's quote in my dissertation because it really perfectly encapsulates what we all need to do to make board gaming a more vital, more flourishing sector and hobby. This has been my third episode of our Family Plays Games Voices, where we celebrate Women's History Month by looking at some of the women in board game design. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our Family Plays Games.